Today my friend brought over his Ford Focus, saying it was leaking a ton of power steering fluid along with a loud noise when turning the wheels. First was finding where the leak was coming from, and just from seeing the fluid towards the top of the engine, I assumed that it was coming from the bottom of the reservoir. A weak spot in these systems is the O-rings, so I removed the reservoir, replaced them, then reinstalled it to then find out that the fluid was not coming from the bottom of the reservoir, but from the cap, leading me back to square one. If power steering fluid is shooting out the top along with visible air bubbles, that means there is air being pulled in somewhere through the system from an unsealed area. I doused everything down in brake clean so everything's dry, then started looking for new leaks. There was a small leak coming from the high pressure lines going to the steering rack, so I removed the lines and found a very obviously cracked O-ring, and at this point I was 100% sure I solved the problem until it started overflowing from the reservoir once again. I had now replaced all the O-rings in the system and could not find any visible leaks anywhere, leaving me very confused. After a lot of research, I learned that in these cars there's a built-in filter inside the reservoir, so I cut it open for the sake of my sanity to find out that only about 30% of the screen was clear, allowing a very small amount of fluid to go through. There needs to be enough flow of power steering fluid through the reservoir to ensure there is no suction of air being created. I've heard of trying to clean these with diesel fuel or brake clean, but I personally think replacing the reservoir is the way to go. I flushed the system of the old fluid, added some ATF, bled the system, and everything is finally looking good. No leaks from anywhere in the system, the squealing noise is now gone, there's no air or fluid exiting from the reservoir, and it feels much smoother when driving. I learned something new today, and I hope you did too, but there's still a couple of issues on my friend's Ford Focus. My friend brought over his Ford Focus, saying it was smoking from under the hood and that he was having to constantly top it off with oil. First was finding where the smoke was coming from, and it was pretty obvious that it was the oil leaking out of the valve cover straight onto the exhaust manifold. The rubber gasket that sits between the valve cover and the cylinder head naturally breaks down over time due to excessive heat and age. Once it gets dry and brittle, oil will start to seep through the cracks and crevices. In this case specifically, the oil did not only leak from the outside of the engine, but on the inside as well, causing a ton of oil to pool in the spark plug tubes to the point where I couldn't even see the plugs, which could cause even more problems. After cleaning everything up, I removed the original gaskets, which were in fact hard and brittle, and replaced them with new ones. Luckily, on this 4-cylinder engine, the job was pretty straightforward, but that's not always the case. Some engines have multiple valve covers, super cramped engine bays, or parts stacked on top of the cover, making this job way more time consuming. After putting everything back together, I did a quick oil change, cleaned up my mess, and started it up. The Ford Focus is no longer smoking from the engine, doesn't have a burnt oil smell, but it definitely needs a little bit more work. Today my friend's car is back in the garage, but this time I'm trying to fix this vibrating issue coming from the steering wheel and the engine. This might not seem like a big deal, but the constant shaking is not only annoying when driving, but it can also cause parts to loosen and wear over time. These mounts are designed to hold the engine and transmission in place while absorbing vibrations. The rubber dries out and cracks, which lets more engine movement transfer through the chassis, making everything feel more rough. I started with the engine mount, which sits behind the coolant reservoir, then I moved on to the transmission mount, which sits underneath the battery. Last was the mount underneath the car that connects the transmission to the subframe. At first glance, none of them looked completely destroyed, but the difference in stiffness was clear. Even if they don't look bad, worn mounts can still cause issues because the rubber gets too soft and squishy to properly absorb movement. Once everything was swapped out, I started the car, and right away the difference was pretty obvious. There was no more shaking in the steering wheel, and the engine was idling smoother than ever. The Acura RSX is throwing a battery light and is cutting out under throttle, so today I'm replacing the alternator to see if that's really the issue. A bad alternator can cause way more issues than you'd expect. Rough idle, electrical glitches, a dead battery, and even false check engine light codes. In my case, there's an O2 sensor code showing up, but before I spend money replacing it, I want to make sure that the code isn't just from low voltage caused by a failing alternator. The alternator sits directly under the power steering pump, and with the leak coming from that area, I'm guessing the leaking fluid is what killed the alternator. It looks like the major leak was fixed at some point, and now there's just a seep, but it's not leaking directly onto the alternator, so that's a problem for another day. I'm pretty sure this is the original one from Honda, and for over 250,000 miles, it didn't do too bad. After starting it up, the battery light is now gone, the engine sounds smoother, and the O2 code cleared. At least for now. I'll have to drive it more to know for sure, but getting the charging system sorted is still a big step towards getting this car back to where it should be. Today on the Project RSX, I'm doing one of the very first things I recommend after you buy a used car, an oil change. You never really know when the last owner changed the oil, the quality of the oil they put in, or if they even use the right type. Checking the old oil can tell you a lot about what's going on inside the engine, and changing it yourself resets the oil interval so you know exactly when it's due next. Since this car has over 250,000 miles, I'm using Valvoline's full synthetic high mileage oil. It's formulated for engines with over 75,000 miles, and it helps address common high mileage issues like oil consumption, small leaks, engine wear, and loss of horsepower from heat and age. Getting the right oil in early makes a difference, especially when you're trying to bring a car like this back the right way. It's a small step, but a necessary one, in getting this Project Acura RSX back on the road.